The Cursed House of Addington Manor. Hello, and welcome to another show of the Ghastly Guide. I'm your host, and today we're going to tell you about one of the most scary family stories ever written down. The story of the Addington family is not for people who get scared easily. What started as a story about wanting success and money quickly turned into something much more evil, a darkness that would live in the rooms of Addington Manor for many, many years. Before we start, I need to warn you. The story you're about to hear has been put together from bits and pieces of old records, personal diaries, and secret government papers that were never supposed to be seen by regular people. Some of what I'll tell you tonight has been hidden on purpose by people in power who thought the public wasn't ready to know such terrible things. Other people would say it's just silly beliefs or the crazy talk of sick minds. But as you'll soon see, the pattern that shows up over hundreds of years is too much the same, too exact to be just chance or group imagination. For those of you who get scared easily, this might be the time to think about whether you want to keep listening. The horrors of Addington Manor are not just about scary things happening to bodies, but about questioning what is real. They make us wonder about our understanding of reality itself. They suggest that under the thin layer of our normal world hides something huge and impossible to understand, something that has used many generations of one family as its way into our world. You've been warned. The year was 1842 when Edward Addington, a smart businessman who wanted success more than anything, bought a huge house in the foggy hills of northern England. The manor had been owned before by the shamed Blackwood family, and it cost much less money than it should have. Local stories said the property was cursed, but Edward thought such talk was just country nonsense. He saw only a chance to make money where others saw darkness. This was the first of many terrible mistakes that would mark the Addington family story. The area itself was full of very old history. Ancient stone circles sat scattered across the nearby empty lands, and old burial hills rested in the shadow of the house. Scientists who study old things had long thought that this place was used for important ceremonies by people who lived here before the Celts. They believed these ancient people chose this spot because of some quality we might now call unusual magnetic forces in the earth. What old peoples thought was the presence of gods, modern science might say was caused by strange natural happenings. But as our story goes on, you may wonder whether such differences are as clear as we like to think. Edward had made his money in coal and steel, businesses built on the broken backs of workers. The time when machines changed, everything was changing England, and Edward put himself right at the bloody front of this change. The number of people who died in his factories was among the highest in the country. His mines went deeper than any others, taking coal from depths that his competitors thought were too dangerous or wouldn't make enough money to bother with. Some of his miners talk about strange old remains found in these deepest tunnels, pieces of creatures that couldn't be named or understood. But such interesting things had a way of disappearing once they were reported to the bosses. Edward's reputation for being cruel came before him, but few people knew just how cruel he really was. People who went against him had a strange habit of disappearing, their fates decided behind closed doors with handshakes and whispers. The bodies of workers who tried to organize unions sometimes washed up on the shores of the Thames, their tongues cut out, a detail the newspapers politely left out. Edward was a man who believed that power was not something you were born with, but something you took by any means needed. His interest in power went beyond just material things. Despite his public dislike of superstitious beliefs, Edward kept a private library of books about the occult and hired teachers to teach him old languages, Hebrew, Sanskrit, and others much more unknown. Visitors to his London home reported seeing strange meetings in the evening hours, attended by some of the most powerful people in British society and politics. What happened in these meetings was never talked about openly, but servants spoke in quiet voices about chanting, strange smells, and guests who left looking somehow smaller, as if something important had been taken from them. When Edward moved into the manor with his young wife Eleanor and their 5 children, he ordered major changes to be made to the house. The workers were brought in from far away. None were local people because residents of nearby villages refused to step foot on the property. Most were immigrants who badly needed work and couldn't understand the warnings whispered in local drinking places. Those who did speak English found their worries dismissed or met with threats of being sent back to their home countries. The work crew lived in temporary housing on the grounds, and from the beginning, they reported strange things happening. Many complained of odd noises in the walls, not the normal settling sound of an old house, but rhythmic tapping that seemed to follow patterns, almost like a secret code. Workers described sudden drops in temperature. Even on warm summer days, cold spots so intense that they could see their breath and ice would form on their tools. Most disturbing was the unsettling feeling of being watched, especially in the East Wing, where men refused to work alone. Edward hired a boss known for his harsh management style to keep the workers in line. Complaints were met with pay cuts or immediate firing. Despite these actions, the project fell behind schedule as workers ran away in the night, leaving their belongings behind rather than spend another hour at Addington Manor. 3 workers died under mysterious conditions during renovation. The first, a stone worker named Gregory, fell from a tall wooden platform while working on the East Wing front. People who saw it happen reported that moments before his fall, Gregory had been staring hard at something inside the room, his face frozen in terror. The second, a woodworker called Thomas, drowned in the estate's lake despite being known as a strong swimmer who had once saved a child from the Thames. His body was found floating face down in the center of the lake with no signs of fighting or injury, except for his eyes, which had turned completely white as if bleached. The third death was perhaps the most disturbing. A young helper named William was found hanging in the cellar with no clear way to have gotten into such a position. The wooden beam from which he hung was nearly 15 feet high with no furniture nearby that could have been used to reach it. More puzzling still, the rope around his neck showed no signs of a knot. It appeared to be one continuous loop, as if woven around his skin. The local authorities, heavily influenced by Edward's generous donations to the county judge and police chief, ruled all 3 deaths as unfortunate accidents. The judge, Sir Reginald Thorpe, was a frequent guest at Edward's London gatherings and shared his interest in the occult. Later investigation would show that Thorpe's family had old connections to Blackwoods, though he worked hard to hide this fact. Construction continued despite the deaths, with new workers brought in to replace those who had died or run away. Edward offered large bonuses for finishing the work, doubling and then tripling the amount as problems got worse. Within 6 months, at a very high cost, both in money and human lives, Addington Manor was transformed into a showcase of Victorian luxury. The final building was a monument to excess and questionable taste. The outside presented a harmonious Gothic revival front, all pointed arches and fancy stonework, rising proudly above carefully landscaped grounds. But the inside was a confusing mix of styles and influences that reflected Edward's strange obsessions. Crystal chandeliers hung from decorated ceilings painted with star charts of suspicious accuracy, showing heavenly bodies unknown to the astronomy of the time. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors with patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Priceless paintings decorated walls of deep red and midnight blue, many showing scenes from unknown mythological traditions, sacrificial ceremonies and creatures that were neither fully human nor fully animal. Most striking was a library which took up the entire west wing of the manor. 3 stories tall with spiral staircases connecting the levels, it housed one of the finest private collections of rare books in England, beyond the expected classics and contemporary works. Edward's collection included ancient books bound in materials that couldn't be easily identified. Scholars later allowed to examine the library described texts in languages that had no known speakers, written on substances that looked like neither paper nor parchment. These books were kept in a special section behind locked glass doors, visible but unreachable to casual visitors. Yet despite its grandness, there was something undeniably oppressive about the atmosphere of Addington Manor. Guests invited to the elaborate housewarming celebration in December 1842 rarely stayed the night, despite the dangerous winter journey that awaited them. Those who did reported troubled sleep and disturbing dreams. Lady Harrington, a close friend of Eleanor's, wrote in her diary, "There is something unwholesome about the air in that house. It feels thick in one's lungs, as if it carries some invisible poison. I woke repeatedly with a feeling of being watched, and once I could swear I saw the doorknob turning slowly, though the door remained locked. I shall not accept another invitation to Addington Manor. Friendship be damned." Eleanor Addington, once bright and sociable, grew increasingly withdrawn as winter deepened into a particularly harsh spring. Where she had once been known for her wit and lively conversation, she now spoke little at social gatherings, her gaze distant and troubled. She fired her lady's maid of many years, claiming the woman was spying on her, and began to refuse food prepared by the kitchen staff, living largely on tea and dry toast that she prepared herself. She spoke of hearing children's laughter in empty corridors and seeing figures dart past doorways from the corner of her eye. Most troubling to the staff was her new habit of stopping mid-sentence, tilting her head as if listening to a voice only she could hear, then responding in whispers to empty air. Edward dismissed her concerns, attributing them to female hysteria, a convenient diagnosis for any woman who dared express discomfort in Victorian England. "The house is settling," he would say with thinly veiled irritation. Nothing more. But Eleanor knew better. There was something evil about Addington Manor, something that seemed to feed on fear and despair. She began keeping a journal documenting the strange occurrences that Edward so readily dismissed. Her handwriting, once elegant and controlled, became increasingly erratic as the entries progressed, the pressure of her pen sometimes tearing through the paper. Her entries grew increasingly disturbed as weeks turned to months. April 18th, 1843. I found William, their youngest son, speaking to the wall in the east wing again. When I asked who he was talking to, he said, "The sad lady who lives inside." Edward says it's merely childish imagination. But William described her in such detail. The lace collar of her dress, the pearl buttons down her back, the dark stains spreading across her stomach. No child could invent such specifics. When I pressed him, William said the lady told him she had lived in the house long ago and that the master hurt her because of the baby. I asked if she meant Edward, and William looked confused. "No, Mother," she said it was before the fire. There's been no fire at Addington Manor in living memory. April 30th, 1843. Margaret's teacher gave notice today. She claims Margaret threatened her with a knife taken from the breakfast table, saying, "They told me to open you up and see what's inside." When confronted, Margaret had no memory of the incident and wept uncontrollably. The poor child hasn't been herself since we moved here. Her night terrors have worsened, and she's taken to collecting dead insects, arranging them in patterns on her windowsill. Dr. Wallace prescribed a medicine to help her sleep, but it only seems to make the nightmares more vivid. This morning, she told me she doesn't want to be hollowed out like the others. When I asked what she meant, she stared at me as if I were a stranger. May 3rd, 1843. The temperature in the master bedroom dropped so severely last night that I could see my breath. Edward slept soundly while I lay awake, watching a dark figure stand motionless at the foot of our bed for hours. I was frozen, unable to scream or wake him. The figure seemed to be made of shadow deeper than the darkness around it, with only the suggestion of a face. 2 hollow spots where eyes should be, and a darker slash that might have been a mouth. It made no sound, no movement, simply watched. When the first light of dawn broke through the curtains, it dissolved like smoke. Edward found me weeping and suggested I visit Dr. Harrison for a medicine to calm my nerves. I fear he thinks I am going mad. Perhaps I am. May 17th, 1843. I ventured into the east wing today, drawn by the sound of a woman weeping. I found nothing, but the crying seemed to follow me, always just around the next corner or behind the next door. Eventually, I came to the room at the end of the corridor, the one Edward has taken as his private study. The door was locked, but I am certain the sounds came from within. When I pressed my ear to the wood, the weeping stopped suddenly, replaced by a whisper so close it might have been inside my own head. "He will hollow you out, too." I fled, but as I reached the main staircase, I glanced back to see Edward standing outside his study door, watching me with an expression I have never seen before. Not anger, but a cold, calculating assessment, as if I were a specimen under glass. June 17th, 1843. 3 more servants have given notice this week. That makes 11 who have left since we moved in. They whisper about rooms that lock themselves, objects that move without being touched, and voices crying out from empty rooms. The gardener's helper swears he saw a procession of figures in white moving across the lawn at midnight, heading toward the old stone circle on the north edge of the property. The new nursemaid refuses to enter the children's rooms after dark, claiming she sees something standing over them as they sleep. Edward has forbidden any discussion of these incidents, threatening immediate dismissal without reference for anyone spreading hysterical nonsense. He grows more distant by the day, spending hours locked in his study or the East Wing library. When he does emerge, there's a feverish gleam in his eyes and a tremor in his hands that he cannot quite control. July 2nd, 1843. The twins have developed a peculiar game they call the Hollow People. They take turns standing perfectly still, while the other drapes them in sheets and pretends to extract something invisible from their chest. When I asked Alexander what they were removing, he replied matter-of-factly, "The light inside, Mother. That's what they want from us." Victoria nodded solemnly and added, "The hungry ones behind the walls need it to make themselves real. I've forbidden the game, but I hear them playing it when they think I'm not listening. Last night, I observed them through a crack in their bedroom door. They weren't using sheets anymore, but standing in the moonlight, making precise cutting motions in the air before their bodies. Most disturbing was their synchronicity. They move as if controlled by a single mind." As Eleanor's mental state got worse, Edward became increasingly absent, spending long hours in his study or away on business. His complexion took on a grayish paleness, and he lost weight rapidly, his once robust frame becoming almost skeletal. Yet, there was a feverish energy about him, a manic intensity that showed up in bursts of activity, followed by days of near catatonia. The household staff reported that he would sometimes be found standing motionless in odd corners of the house, staring intently at blank walls or empty air, mumbling equations and phrases in languages none of them recognized. The children were largely left in the care of nannies and tutors, most of whom rarely lasted more than a few weeks before fleeing the oppressive atmosphere of Addington Manor. Young William developed a stutter and began wetting his bed. Margaret was caught multiple times attempting to harm smaller children from the village when they ventured too close to the estate boundaries. The twins, Alexander and Victoria, seemed to communicate in a private language, falling silent whenever adults entered the room. Only Charles, the eldest at 16, appeared relatively unaffected, though servants noted he had taken to carrying a silver letter opener at all times and barricading his bedroom door at night. By autumn, the situation had gotten much worse. Eleanor's journal entries became increasingly fragmented and difficult to understand. She wrote geometries that hurt the eyes and voices that speak from behind time. She drew diagrams that made no mathematical sense, yet created a disturbing sense of depth when stared at for too long. Several pages contained nothing but the same phrase, repeated hundreds of times. "They are hollowing us out one by one." The turning point came on a stormy night in November 1843. Eleanor, unable to sleep, wandered the corridors of the East Wing, an area of the house that Edward had inexplicably declared off limits to everyone, including family. The last coherent entry in her journal, dated November 13th, describes her decision to defy this prohibition. "I can bear it no longer. The sounds from behind the walls have become unbearable, not just weeping now, but screams that slice through my dreams and leave me bleeding into wakefulness. Edward has forbidden any of us from entering the East Wing's third floor, but he himself spends hours there, returning with a look of terrible exaltation that chills my blood. Tonight, while he is away in London, I shall discover what secret he guards so jealously. May God forgive my trespass and protect me from what I might find." What she discovered there would change the course of the Addington family forever, according to fragmentary accounts pieced together later from servants' testimonies and Charles's hidden journal. Eleanor used a stolen key to access the locked staircase leading to the third floor of the East Wing. The area had been completely transformed from its original design. The multiple rooms shown on the architect's plans have been converted into a single vast chamber with an oddly disorienting layout. Corners that seemed more or less than 90 degrees, a ceiling that appeared to recede infinitely upward in some places, while pressing claustrophobically low in others. But it was the floor that drew Eleanor's horrified attention. The expensive Persian carpets found throughout the rest of the manor were absent here. Instead, the entire floor was covered in an intricate mosaic composed of thousands of tiny tiles of various materials. Some stone, some metal, some materials she could not identify. Together, They formed an immense geometric pattern that seemed to shift and pulsate in the flickering candle light. At the center of this pattern was a circular depression about 6 feet in diameter. Behind a false wall concealed by a tapestry, Eleanor found a hidden chamber. The room was small and windowless, its walls covered in strange symbols etched into the stone. In the center stood a pedestal holding a leather-bound book. Eleanor would later describe in her journal as ancient beyond reckoning, its cover fashioned from some material I dare not contemplate too deeply. The pages contained writings in several languages, some recognizable as Latin and Greek, others utterly foreign to Eleanor's educated eye. Interspersed among the texts were disturbing illustrations depicting ritual sacrifice and communion with entities that seemed neither human nor animal, but some horrific combination of both. Careful examination of these images revealed a terrible pattern. Each depicted a circular chamber with a distinctive floor pattern identical to the one in the room Eleanor had just left. Most disturbing were the illustrations showing human figures arranged in specific positions around the central depression. Their chests opened to reveal not the expected internal organs, but vast starry voids, as if each human body contained an entire cosmos that was being somehow harvested or channeled. The final pages of the book contained names and dates spanning centuries, with Edward Addington's name and the date December 21st, 1843, the winter solstice, inscribed in fresh ink. Eleanor had discovered Edward's darkest secret. His fortune had not been built on business skill alone, but on forbidden knowledge and terrible agreements with forces beyond human understanding. The renovations of Addington Manor had not been merely aesthetic. They had transformed the property into a massive sigil, a beacon to attract entities from beyond the veil of our reality. And the deaths that had occurred during construction had not been accidents, but deliberate sacrifices. Their life energy used to power whatever terrible mechanism Edward was creating. When Edward discovered Eleanor in the hidden chamber, his rage was terrifying. According to Harriet Brown, a housemaid who had followed Eleanor out of concern for her mistress's safety, Edward's face underwent a horrifying transformation as he confronted his wife. "It weren't natural what I saw," Harriet later testified to a parish priest seeking forgiveness for her failure to intervene. His lordship's face seemed to ripple like there was something moving beneath the skin. And his eyes, God help me, but they weren't human eyes anymore. They were like windows opening onto somewhere else, somewhere vast and cold and hungry. Servants reported hearing shouting followed by an eerie silence. Most disturbing was Eleanor's scream, which began as a normal expression of human terror, but transformed mid-cry into something that defied description, a sound that seemed to come from multiple throats simultaneously, modulating in ways a human vocal cord should not be capable of producing. The next morning, Edward announced that Eleanor had suffered a nervous collapse and would be recuperating at a private sanatorium in Switzerland. He produced letters supposedly written by Eleanor over the following months describing her treatment and gradual recovery, but the handwriting bore only a passive resemblance to her own. She was never seen again. In the household accounts ledger, there is an entry dated November 14th, 1843, the day after Eleanor's disappearance, for an unusually large delivery of quicklime, a substance commonly used to accelerate decomposition and mask the odor of decay. The delivery was made to the East Wing, and workers were forbidden from entering the area for several days afterward. When they were finally permitted to resume their duties, they reported that the mosaic floor in the large chamber had been extensively cleaned with several damaged tiles replaced. In the months that followed, Edward's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He dismissed all but the most essential staff and kept his children under strict isolation. No visitors were permitted, and the children were withdrawn from their schools and social engagements. A physician, Dr. James Morrison, was summoned regularly to the manor, but the nature of his treatments remained undocumented. Local gossip suggested that the doctor, once respected in the community, had developed a laudanum addiction and substantial gambling debts shortly before being retained by Edward Addington. Locals reported strange lights emanating from the manor at odd hours and unsettling sounds carrying across the moors on still nights, sounds that resembled chanting in no known language, punctuated by what some described as the weeping of countless voices, all crying out in unison. Farmers reported livestock being found dead near the property boundaries, their bodies drained of blood without any visible wounds. Most disturbing were the reports of missing children from the surrounding villages. 7 disappeared between December 1843 and June 1844, all within a 10-mile radius of Addington Manor. Official investigations attributed these disappearances to accidents or runaways, but local families remain convinced of a more sinister explanation. The eldest Addington child, Charles, began documenting his own observations in a hidden journal after his mother's disappearance. His writings, discovered decades later, concealed in a hollowed-out section of the manor's west wall, provide a chilling account of the family's descent into madness and the true horror that was unfolding within the walls of Addington Manor. "Father has changed," wrote 16-year-old Charles in December 1843. His eyes seemed different, somehow deeper, with a strange gleam that was not there before. He spends hours locked in the East Wing, and when he emerges, he often doesn't recognize us immediately. Last week, he called me by a name I've never heard before, then looked confused and retired to his study without supper. By spring of 1844, the remaining servants reported that Edward had taken to sleepwalking, often found standing motionless in the children's rooms in the dead of night, watching them sleep with an unnatural stillness. The children themselves began exhibiting disturbing behaviors. 10-year-old William was discovered mutilating small animals in the garden. 12-year-old Margaret began speaking in languages she had never studied. The twins, Alexander and Victoria, developed an obsession with death, creating elaborate funeral rituals for their dolls and pets. Only Charles seemed to maintain his sanity, though his journal entries betray a growing fear that whatever had taken hold of his family might claim him, too. He began planning an escape, secretly corresponding with his mother's brother in London. "I fear what father is becoming," Charles wrote in April 1844. "Yesterday, I saw him in the garden at dawn, burying something wrapped in bloody sheets. When he returned to the house, there was soil beneath his fingernails and a serenity to his expression that chilled me to the bone. I have not seen Margaret since the previous afternoon." Charles never managed to escape. On May 17, 1844, a fire broke out in the east wing of Addington Manor. By the time the local fire brigade arrived, the blaze had consumed most of the house. They found Edward Addington in the garden, calmly watching the inferno with what witnesses described as an expression of rapturous fulfillment. Inside the charred remains of the manor, authorities discovered a scene of unspeakable horror. The bodies of all 5 Addington children were found in the cellar, arranged in a precise geometric pattern around a stone altar. Forensic examination would later reveal that the children had not died in the fire, but had been systematically sacrificed in what appeared to be an elaborate ritual. Edward Addington was arrested and committed to Bethlehem Asylum, where he spent the remainder of his days in seemingly catatonic silence. However, asylum records indicate that he would occasionally become animated during certain astronomical alignments, attempting to draw complex symbols with whatever materials were available, often his own blood. The Addington case might have faded into obscurity, dismissed as the isolated madness of one depraved individual, had it not been for what happened next. Despite the horrific events and the manor's almost complete destruction, a distant cousin of Edward's, James Addington, claimed the property in 1850 and set about rebuilding it according to the original plans. James was a respected scholar with no known history of mental instability or cruelty. His decision to resurrect Addington Manor puzzled many, but he dismissed concerns with rational explanations about family legacy and the quality of the remaining structure. Within 2 years, the manor stood once again, an exact replica of its former self. History, as they say, has a way of repeating itself. Within months of moving in with his wife and 3 children, James began exhibiting the same obsessive behaviors that had characterized Edward's decline. His wife, Rebecca, documented increasingly disturbing changes in her husband's personality and strange occurrences within the newly rebuilt manor. James spent 3 days and nights in the East Wing without emerging even for meals, she wrote to her sister in 1853. When he finally appeared, he looked somehow younger, more vital. Yet, there was something wrong about his eyes. They seemed to reflect light differently, like a cat's eyes in darkness. When I expressed concern about his absence, he smiled in a way that made my blood run cold and said, "I was never absent, my dear. I've been here all along watching you sleep." The pattern established by Edward Addington repeated itself with frightening precision through James and subsequent generations of Addingtons who inhabited the manor. Each time the family patriarch would discover something in the East Wing that changed him. Each time family members would vanish or die under mysterious circumstances. And each time, locals would report strange lights and sounds emanating from the property on specific dates corresponding to ancient pagan festivals. Parish records from a neighboring village of Thornfield document a disturbing trend. During the periods when the Addington family was in residence at the manor, disappearances of local children increased dramatically. Between 1850 and 1870, 23 children vanished without trace within a 10-mile radius of Addington Manor. Local authorities investigated, but could never find sufficient evidence to implicate the increasingly reclusive Addington family. By the turn of the century, Addington Manor had been rebuilt 3 times following mysterious fires, and 4 generations of Addingtons had met violent ends within its walls. Still, distant relatives would emerge to claim the property, drawn by some inexplicable compulsion to restore the manor and continue whatever dark purpose it served. In 1901, the property passed to Richard Addington, a successful London physician with a young family and no previous connection to more sinister aspects of his ancestry. He approached the reconstruction with scientific skepticism, determined to dispel the superstitious nonsense surrounding his family name. The so-called Addington curse is nothing more than a confluence of unfortunate circumstances, perhaps exacerbated by environmental factors such as carbon monoxide from faulty heating systems, which explain the reported hallucinations and erratic behaviors. He wrote in a letter to a colleague, "I intend to document everything methodically and finally put these ridiculous rumors to rest." Richard installed electric lighting throughout the manor, a modern innovation at the time, and hired a team of scientists to analyze the air quality, water supply, and structural integrity of the building. His rational approach seemed promising initially, but within 6 months, his correspondence took a darker turn. "There is something here," he wrote in increasingly agitated handwriting, "something that defies scientific explanation. I've seen it moving through the walls at night. I've heard it whispering in languages that have been dead for millennia. The children hear it, too. They've started drawing pictures of it. Elizabeth, his wife, says I'm working too hard, that my mind is playing tricks. But how can we all be experiencing the same delusion?" His final letter, dated November 12, 1902, contains a disturbing revelation. The East Wing, always the East Wing. I've discovered why. The original foundations remain intact beneath the newer construction. Edward wasn't the first. The Blackwoods before him, and God knows how many others before them. They all found it. The chamber beneath the East Wing. It's far older than the manor, older perhaps than England itself. The symbols on the walls match nothing in any archaeological record, yet I recognize them somehow. They speak to something primitive in my brain, something that existed before humanity crawled from the primordial ooze. God help me. I understand now what must be done, what has always been done. 3 days later, Richard's wife and children were found dead in their beds, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. Richard himself was discovered in the cellar beneath the East Wing, his body contorted in an impossible position, surrounded by arcane symbols drawn in a mixture of blood and ash. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the responding officers would later require extensive psychiatric treatment for what they witnessed at the scene. Addington Manor was abandoned after the tragedy of 1902. The property fell into disrepair, becoming a magnet for thrill seekers, occultists, and the morbidly curious. Local authorities eventually declared the structure unsafe and barricaded the grounds, but trespassers continued to find their way in. Many never came out again. In 1923, a group of Cambridge scholars specializing in anthropology and ancient religions gained legal access to property for academic research. Led by Professor Walter Hartley, they intended to document the unusual symbols reported in the cellar and compare them to known occult traditions. Only one member of the expedition, a graduate student named Thomas Piper, returned alive. His account of what happened was so outlandish that he was initially committed to an asylum. His journals, however, provide the most comprehensive documentation of what may have been happening at Addington Manor for generations. The symbols in the cellar are not static, Piper wrote. They shift when not directly observed, rearranging themselves into new configurations. Professor Hartley believed they represent a form of non-Euclidean mathematics, equations designed to solve problems of dimensional transit. In simpler terms, the entire manor is a machine, a door to somewhere else. Piper's account suggests that the Addington family have been serving as caretakers of this door for generations, willingly or unwillingly. Each patriarch would discover the truth and become consumed by it, driven to maintain the integrity of the dimensional gateway through increasingly horrific sacrifices. What lies beyond the door cannot be described in human language. Piper continued. Hartley opened it. God help us all. He actually opened it. I saw only a glimpse as I fled, but that glimpse was enough to shatter my understanding of reality. The others weren't as fortunate. Their screams still echo in my dreams, but it wasn't pain they were expressing. It was rapture. Thomas Piper spent the rest of his life in self-imposed isolation, creating intricate paintings that attempted to capture what he had witnessed. The few surviving works are housed in a secure facility at Miskatonic University in Massachusetts, available for viewing only with special permission due to the documented psychological effects they have on observers. Following the Cambridge incident, the British government quietly acquired the Addington property. Official records indicate it was repurposed as a military storage facility during World War II, but declassified documents from the 1990s reveal a different story. Between 1939 and 1945, a specialized unit of British intelligence known as the Extraordinary Threats Division, ETD, occupied the manor, studying the phenomena reported there for potential application in the war effort. Colonel James Blackwood, a name that raises disturbing questions about his possible connection to the original owners of property, led the ETD operations at Addington Manor. His official reports describe anomalous energies and localized reality distortions centered around the East Wing. Whatever exists beneath Addington Manor defies conventional understanding, Blackwood wrote in a top-secret memorandum dated June 1943. It appears to respond to human intention and emotion, particularly fear and desire. The symbolic configurations in the cellar function as a form of programming language, allowing limited control over the phenomena, but at significant risk to the operator's psychological stability. The ETD conducted numerous experiments at the site, most of which ended disastrously. Test subjects exposed to the cellar for extended periods exhibited rapid personality deterioration, followed by either catatonia or extreme violence. Several researchers reported encountering doppelgangers of themselves or long-deceased family members in the corridors of the East Wing. Most disturbing were the temporal anomalies. Clocks in the manor ran at different speeds depending on their proximity to the cellar. In one documented incident, a researcher entered the East Wing for what he perceived as 20 minutes, but emerged 3 days later with no awareness of the time discrepancy. His journal contained over 200 pages of writing he had no memory of producing, mostly the same phrase repeated in increasingly distorted handwriting. They are watching from behind the walls. By 1944, the casualties among ETD personnel had become unsustainable. Colonel Blackwood made the decision to seal the cellar with reinforced concrete and withdraw from the property. His final report contained a recommendation that Addington Manor be destroyed completely, the land salted, and the location stricken from all official records. "What we have contained here is not defeated," he wrote. "It is merely imprisoned, and imprisonment is not." If you like this video, please subscribe to Ghastly Guide channel and also like and comment.